Welcome guys to another episode with the Doomed Hell. Today I wanted to take a look at another video game review. This one specifically is very close to my heart because I do really like the Far Cry series. It is one of my favorite series of all time in terms of video games, and I always liked how it goes through a lot of subjects very quickly, a lot of themes very quickly, and it basically composes it through an action-intensive, free-roaming game. These are all things that I really like, especially the FPS part of the game. I find it rather entertaining, to say the least. Not exactly very realistic, but at least entertaining. Now, I wanted to go through this video game specifically with a libertarian perspective, and there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, I felt as though the series was more and more politicized at this point, and it was important that I took approximately the field which I personally associate with. I wouldn't call myself the strongest libertarian. I still believe in a, kind of state, but I do also think that it is necessary that we live in a society where people rely on people, and less so that people rely on the government. So to that extent, I am a libertarian, if you will. So when looking at the trailers that this video game came out with, and seeing that the new enemy is a cultist in the United States, I thought that it would be interesting to see the criticisms which Ubisoft's game devs think. And the reality is that when looking at the devs, I often see myself entertaining the idea that they must be social justice warriors. And that's not necessarily with proper merit, it's just that it seems as though I always go back to that idea. And I think there are some basically I'm going to go looking at the video game and see if there's any kind of significant theme that is overplayed and potentially plagued with SJWism. And I'm going to kind of look at the intro of the video game. So what we saw is, first and foremost is the cult. And for lack of a better word, I think that they do serve a certain cliche in our society. There have been multiple occasions in U.S. history where you had a lot of cults, which took parts of a community, typically a secluded community, a community far out in the countryside, and was able to invent new and scary ideas, which, coincidentally ended up in very large firefights. Waco is one that I typically think of. Now, does this game really do it justice? That's another story for another time, I feel as though. But for now, we can kind of look at this as a kind of potential social community inside a libertarian society. Now, I wouldn't outright say that the cult that we see in the game is a caricature of modern libertarians, them being in a community, but more so that most recorded incidents of Christian cultists actually resemble more of a kind of socialist movement. And I think we can look at specifically the 1838 Mormon War, which is probably and arguably one of the first cult conflicts that we had in the United States. This happened in the state of Missouri, around the Jackson County, and basically you had a lot of Mormons which thought their land was deserved to themselves, and they decided to fight for it. Basically, a little summary of what happened. The Mormons believed, after a revelation recorded on June 6, 1831, that if they were righteous, they would inherit the land held by others, which is now the land of your enemies in Missouri. Their economic cohesion allowed the Mormons to dominate local economies. They believed that Native Americans were descendants of Israelites and proselytes among them extensively, which is one of the reasons why I was saying that they basically deserve that land. And most Mormon immigrants to Missouri, which was at the time a slave state, came from areas which were sympathetic to abolitionism. So what we can take from this is that firstly, the Mormons had a lot of economic power, but what brought them to the land and basically trying to exploit the land, well, I wouldn't call it exploiting, but at least exploiting the contracts of the ownership of the land, was the fact that they felt as though they deserved the land due to some religious reasons and maybe some, ethnic rights reasons, and also some cultural differences with, and maybe even legal differences with, the system of the state, which, for instance, was they were against abolitionism versus the state had at this time it was a slave state. Now let's take in comparison the video game, which doesn't make all that much specific examples that we could look at this sample of history, but I think that a great example is the fact that they created a new, very dangerous drug, which they were able to enslave people and give them this drug so that they can use them. Now, although this is kind of a counter comparison, for one, Mormons were against slaves, or slavery, I should say, and for the other, well, in the game, the cults were basically for slavery or a kind of slavery. But otherwise, it seems as though the game is basically showing that the path of Eden, or Eden's Gate, or whatever the cult is called, basically has an extreme divide with the actual laws and their own laws and their own values. And this is kind of why they go into conflict. Now, in a perfect libertarian nation, we would see exactly what happens in the video game. We would see people that don't agree with this new cult and these new rules fight back against this bullying micro-state. And I call it a micro-state because it is exactly what it is. They have their own sets of laws, own sets of beliefs, and they think that it is best to bully others into submission. And a lot of libertarians think that way. I don't personally 100% agree, but at least to some extent. Now, the next part I'd like to talk about is probably a common theme with a lot of both right-wing and left-wing libertarians, but also just the right overall as we see them in current-day media. And that is the reoccurrence of conspiracy theories or prophecies being foretold, or basically conspiracy theories which ended up being true. And it's such a common theme with just modern political radicals. They see an event, or they explain an event that may happen in the future, and if it happens to a certain extent, they basically assume that the source is right, the source is correct, and this has happened so many times in the past. And I think what this video game really criticizes is the fact that sometimes our conspiracy theories are so powerful and moving that we often associate it with our own tipping point in mental stability. And many events have happened in the very short past where this has happened. A lot of school shootings happen exactly in that manner. People that think a certain way due to paranoia of society, or paranoia of specific events in their lives and their social lives, end up in serious shootings. And this is probably the number one thing that is dangerous associated with gun ownership. Now, I'm not saying that we should remove guns. I think that is illogical as a libertarian. It is less than illogical. It is not right. It is not morally right or legally acceptable. But what I am saying is that the game feels as though it delves into that subject where you have conspiracy theorists, the cult, which effectively thinks that the government is completely against them and doesn't want them on the planet, and that is, it kind of fuels back to the fact that they think they're right. They believe, they have strong beliefs in something. For instance, the Mormons, they had strong beliefs that they deserve that land because they are the spiritual successors to the Native Americans. They basically are spiritual descendants to the Native Americans, and that they are the people of God. And it's exactly what we see in the video game. They think they are the people of God, and if you don't agree with them, then they will shoot you down. And when the government didn't comply with them, that's really when they went to war. That's what we see in the intro of the video game. This idea that we have this very strong cult which basically controls their community with mental lies and complexities is reinforced with the kind of on the nose, but I guess to a certain extent funny TV clip that we see right at the beginning of the video game, where the cult leader says to say yes. If you say yes, then you win. And yeah, it goes back to, yes manism, very real pyramid schemes which happened during the 80s and 90s, and some cults which had this kind of philosophy where positive feedback is stronger than everything else. And it's just not the case. You need to be realistic, obviously, if you want to stay sane in this world. So these are some recurring themes that I noticed right from the beginning of the video game all the way to the end, and I found them pretty interesting. Obviously, this is not a game that has as many themes coming in and out in the narrative over Far Cry 4 and even Far Cry 3 or even 2 if you look at it that way. But Far Cry 5 at least has some good ideas. And although on my first walkthrough I was really disappointed with the game, and I felt like as though there was some SJW-ism that was happening, playing it again, there are definitely some aspects which are fun, and hoping that I can look past the bad themes, narrative, and some of the gameplay mechanics which I wish they just didn't remove, and just enjoy myself playing the game. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and have a good day.